Dr. Cristiano recently discovered the gene that makes these mice bald. It's not one of the genes that causes male pattern baldness. They haven't been found yet. But its discovery will surely help us to grow hair, or lose it, when we want to. As for Chewie, he remains proud of who he is and what he's got.
Una bendición, yo creo que Dios hace las cosas por algo, ¿no? Y no estoy, ¿cómo se le dice? Me siento, al principio sí me sentía mal por eso, pero ahora ya me siento normal, si no me siento bien si no lo tengo, me siento raro.
Modern genetics shows us, if ever we doubted it, that the color of our skins or the amount of hair on our bodies is independent of our humanity. So too with the myriad other ways in which we differ from each other, the subtle differences in our faces and in our skulls. It's just that we don't know a lot about them, because the study of human variety is in part the study of race.
But the study of racial differences is deeply unfashionable, and for very good reasons. Reasons to do with history.
Science has, at various times and places, lent authority to social injustice. The result is that for decades, the study of normal human physical variety became all but taboo. No longer. Some think it's time to look at the delicate question of race again. I do too. It's a curious thing, but for all that geneticists have learned about what gives our skin color, or makes some people hairy or hairless, they have barely begun to give an account of the genes responsible for the differences between races. The complicity of racial scientists in the death camps of the Third Reich ensured that after the war, geneticists were at pains to dismiss the notion that peoples from different parts of the globe differed in any important way.
Their argument is a compelling one. Our genes, they say, show us that we are one species that originated in Africa about 70,000 years ago and spread rapidly across the globe. This rapid expansion has resulted in our genetic stock being remarkably similar. To be sure, there are genetic differences between a Swazi and a Swede, but they can be less than the differences between any two Shetland Islanders. This has led some geneticists to claim that as far as they are concerned, races do not exist. They are social constructs or the remnants of discredited ideologies.
But if races don't exist, then why does a moment's glance at a stranger's face serve to identify the continent, perhaps even the country, from which his or her ancestors came?
The differences in genetic stock between populations, although small, is large enough to imply the existence of hundreds, perhaps thousands of genetic variants that are common, even ubiquitous on one continent, but rare or even absent on another. Among them will be genes that affect the shapes of our skulls.
The study of skulls, however, has had a slightly uneasy position in the history of anthropology.
For a long time, measurements of human skulls were used to try to justify a number of political and social notions. People thought that, for example, you could measure in a skull or even tell from the shape. You could tell somebody was intelligent, if somebody was a criminal, if somebody had, I don't know, a bad family history, which of course you can't.
The classification of racial differences through skull shapes begins with Petrus Camper, a leading Dutch anatomist of the mid-18th century, who produced a famous diagram in which humanity was ordered in a hierarchy from the Greek god Apollo down to apes. In his diagram, Africans were close to apes, Europeans were close to Apollo. But Camper was no racist. In fact, he was trying to suggest how all humans were related. Unfortunately, the image spoke louder than the text. It was to become an icon of 19th century anthropology.
If you were Kemper, you'd arrange these skulls, much as I've done here, in a sort of an evolutionary progression of relative facial flatness. But of course, what Kemper didn't realize is that the people with the flattest faces in the world, what he would have said are the noblest, most beautiful, most advanced people, well, they're not Europeans at all. They're these chaps. They're Inuit, Eskimos from Canada.
Despite the troubled history of craniometry, the study of skulls remains important, revealing human diversity.
Physical anthropologists have measured hundreds of parameters on skulls, hundreds of different dimensions. And in nearly all of them, they find that skulls from people from different parts of the world differ from each other. The differences are everywhere. Here are two obvious ones. Over here, Maori skull. And it's a wonderful thing. It's huge. It's massive. I mean, this is from another oceanic island. Rito pygmy from the Andamans. They're very small. You can see if you take a look at these skulls that there are just huge differences between them, just in the sheer robustness of the skull. The Maori, you could hit them over the head with a club and nothing would happen. The Negrito, you'd fracture instantly.
But if the study of race was stalled, it has started once again. Today, a handful of scientists are looking for racial differences, not in our skulls, but in our genes. They're scouring our genomes for what they call AIMs, ancestrally informative markers. One such scientist is Mark Shriver, who works here at Penn State University in Pennsylvania.
Some of the different types of traits that result from AIMs are things like red hair, very much focused in the British Isles and has spreading distributions down into France and other parts of Europe. Things like skin color. You know, we know a lot about the patterns of skin color across the world. Populations at the equator are very much darker than other populations. In some groups, you know, there have been dramatic differences in height. For example, the different pygmy populations of Africa, and also, you know, the different taller populations in Africa, like the Maasai herdsmen.
So far, only a handful of such ancestrally informative markers has been found. And yet, remarkably, using these genes, it is possible to tell, more or less, the ethnic mix that makes up any individual. I'm going to get my AIMs tested, and I'm rather unsure of what I will find.
Where I come from is not an altogether straightforward matter. I'm Dutch, but I have a French name. And as regards my looks, well, anywhere from Cairo to Madrid would be about the score. My mother is a South African, not just any South African, she's an Afrikaner, a white Afrikaans-speaking South African. One of those South African families who have been in the country for about 300 years. Ostensibly white, it's quite possible that, like many Afrikaner families, they're really not that white at all. That they have in fact interbred to at least some degree with the local population. All of these things, which aren't recorded anywhere, might be potentially revealed by my AIMs.
My swab will be sent here, a DNA testing facility in Florida. Hundreds of samples arrive here every day. Zach Gaskin and Matt Thomas test these samples to ascertain people's ancestry. Instead of looking at superficial differences to make judgments about race, they look to DNA to see what lies beneath.
Basically, the way we process DNA here is we will collect a sample from a person, usually through a mouth swab. There's some cells that are present on that swab, and we break them open and have a process that purifies and collects the DNA from those cells. And that's what we use to do all our testing.
Each person's DNA is compared to 4 reference populations: European, African, East Asian, and Native American.